My name is Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The summer afternoon had settled quietly over St. Mary Mead, that little English village which, to the unknowing outsider, appeared nothing more than a sleepy collection of whitewashed cottages, rose-laden fences, and gossip that never quite died down. To me, however, it was the stage upon which life, with all its flaws, its secrets, and its occasional bursts of tragedy, was forever being played. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of St. Mary Mead, had long thought myself a practical observer of my parishioners. Yet even with years of sermons behind me, I could never claim to understand them entirely. They remained a collection of puzzles, some easy to solve, others stubbornly resistant to reason. It was my habit, when the heat of the afternoon became too much, to retreat into the cool dimness of my study. There, surrounded by the quiet rustle of papers, the faint smell of leather-bound books, and the comforting tick of the old clock on the mantelpiece, I tried to find some order in the confusion that was parish life. My wife Griselda teased me often for retreating into that sanctuary, calling me an absent-minded saint, though I had long since accepted that her playful exaggerations were part of her charm. That afternoon, however, peace was not to be mine. I had scarcely arranged my sermon notes when I heard the heavy tread of a man's boots coming up the path and, moments later, the sharp rap of knuckles upon the door. The maid ushered in Colonel Lucius Prothero, justice of the peace and the terror of nearly every soul in St. Mary Mead. He filled the doorway with his broad shoulders and stiff military bearing, his sun-browned face already set into the frown that seemed his natural expression. "Good afternoon, vicar," he said briskly, as though politeness were a concession he could ill afford. "I hope I don't intrude." I gestured him toward the chair opposite my desk, though inwardly I could not help a sigh. Colonel Prothero was one of those men who brought with him not ease but a certain bristling discomfort. In his presence one always felt examined, judged, and found lacking. "You will forgive me," he continued, lowering himself into the chair with military stiffness. "But I must speak plainly. Matters in this village are going to rack and ruin. Slack discipline, loose morals, and a general decline in standards. Someone must take action. And as justice of the peace, that burden falls upon me. Frankly, Clement, I wonder if you do enough to uphold proper conduct in your parish." This was hardly the first time he had leveled such a charge at me, yet it never failed to raise my hackles. I reminded myself, however, that patience was a virtue particularly necessary for a man of the cloth. "I do what I can, Colonel," I said mildly. "The church is not a whip to drive men, but a hand to guide them." He snorted, unimpressed. "Guidance is all very well, but discipline, sir. Discipline is what we need." That young artist fellow, Redding I believe his name is, lurking about with sketchbooks and staring at women in fields. "And your curate, Hawes, forever looking pale and nervous as though he has something to hide. It won't do, Clement. It simply won't do." As he rattled on, I could not help noticing the small details that spoke more than his bluster. His clenched fists upon the armrests, the twitch of irritation in his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed whenever he mentioned certain villagers. Here was a man who had made enemies, though he seemed unaware, or perhaps unconcerned about it. When at last he rose to leave, having delivered his judgment upon half the parish, I felt a wave of relief. He paused at the door, casting a glance toward the garden beyond the window. There, beneath the shade of the yew tree, stood my wife Griselda, her fair hair gleaming in the sun as she bent to speak with Miss Marple, our elderly neighbor whose sharp blue eyes seemed to see more than anyone credited. The colonel's frown deepened. "Young wives," he muttered, "have far too much idle time. And as for old ladies, well, they would do better to tend their knitting than to pry into other people's affairs." With that parting shot, he marched down the path, leaving behind an air of stormy disapproval. I joined Griselda and Miss Marple in the garden. Griselda, as ever, was brimming with laughter, the colonel's dour presence having made little impression on her spirits. Miss Marple, on the other hand, wore that look of quiet contemplation that always unsettled me. She was knitting. Of course, she always was, but her eyes had followed the colonel's retreating figure with an expression of keen interest. "A difficult man," I remarked. "Dangerous," Miss Marple replied softly. Without lifting her eyes from her needles, I stared at her. "Surely not dangerous, Miss Marple." "Overbearing, yes. Unpleasant, certainly. But dangerous?" She looked up then, and I saw the spark in her gaze. "My dear vicar, When a man makes enemies as freely as Colonel Prothero does, he courts danger whether he realizes it or not. People are very seldom saints. Resentment festers, tempers flare, and sometimes the unexpected happens. I gave a small laugh, though uneasily. You speak as though you expect murder around every corner. Not around every corner, she said, returning her attention to her knitting. But here in St. Mary Mead, I should not be at all surprised. Her words lingered with me long after she had departed, leaving me to the evening quiet. I could not shake the sense that her simple statement carried more weight than mere idle fancy. Miss Marple, for all her gentle appearance, was no idle gossip, she observed. She remembered, and she understood. The days that followed only added to my disquiet. For everywhere I turned, it seemed the Colonel's heavy hand had left fresh grievances. He scolded the children for trespassing in his fields, berated the shopkeeper for careless accounts, and even threatened to summon the constable when he caught a boy pocketing apples. More than once I heard murmured words in the lanes, muttered curses behind hedges, a rising tide of resentment that spread like smoke. Even in my own household his shadow fell. Griselda, spirited as she was, bristled under his lectures on propriety. "If that man comes here one more time to criticize your sermons," she declared one evening, "I shall tell him plainly that his soul could do with a little saving of its own." I smiled at her vehemence, though inwardly I wondered whether such bluntness might only add her to the Colonel's growing list of adversaries. It was, perhaps, inevitable that events would come to a head. Looking back now, I can see the pattern forming, the way threads were tightening, weaving themselves into a design none of us yet recognized. But at the time, it was all fragments, an overheard quarrel, a door slammed in anger, a muttered threat carried on the summer air. Each seemed unimportant in itself, but together they were leading us step by step toward the darkness that was to fall upon the vicarage. The days that followed the Colonel's visit seemed charged with an odd tension, as though the village itself held its breath. St. Mary Mead had never been free of small quarrels and whispered resentments, but now those undercurrents felt stronger, darker, as if every friendly smile concealed a grievance waiting to be spoken aloud. Perhaps it was merely my imagination, influenced by Miss Marple's unsettling remark about danger. Yet everywhere I turned I saw shadows gathering. One evening, as the sun lowered itself behind the yews, I went into the village to deliver a message to Mrs. Price Ridley, a formidable widow with opinions as sharp as her tongue. Passing along the lane, I found Lawrence Redding standing near the stile, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He looked restless, almost feverish, his eyes darting about as though he feared being observed. When he saw me, he gave a start and then a laugh that rang hollow. "Ah, Vicar, out on your rounds?" "As always," I replied with a smile. "And you, Mr. Redding? Looking for inspiration?" He hesitated, then said quickly, "Something of the kind. The light at this hour, yes, it has a certain quality." Yet as he spoke, his gaze shifted past me, down the lane where Anne Prothero was walking, her figure graceful in the fading light. For a moment, a look passed between them. Too swift, perhaps, for most to notice, but not for me. It was the look of two souls who shared a secret. I continued on my way, but the image lingered in my mind. Anne Prothero, the Colonel's much younger wife, had always struck me as charming yet troubled, a woman too delicate for the weight of the Colonel's iron will. To imagine her in quiet understanding with young Redding was not difficult, though to speak it aloud would have been to invite scandal. In St. Mary Mead, scandal traveled faster than wildfire. Later that week, I was summoned to the Colonel's house on a matter he described as urgent. The Prothero residence, standing solid and severe, reflected its master in every line of its architecture. Inside, however, there was a tension that contradicted the grandeur. Anne received me in the drawing room, her smile faint and her hands clasped tightly together. She looked pale, as though she had not slept. "My husband will be down shortly," she said, her voice low. He has something to discuss with you." I reassured her with what gentleness I could, though I felt at once that she was afraid of whatever subject the Colonel intended to raise. When at last he entered, his face grim, he wasted no time in pleasantries. "Clement," he barked, "I must speak with you about my wife." Anne gave a stifled cry, but the Colonel pressed on relentlessly. "There has been talk, ugly talk, about her association with that fellow Redding. I will not have my name dragged through the mud by idle tongues. I have warned her, but she seems deaf to reason. Now I ask you, as her spiritual advisor, to impress upon her the gravity of her conduct. The humiliation in Anne's eyes was painful to behold. I felt torn between sympathy for her and duty to keep the peace. I spoke calmly, urging restraint and reminding the colonel that gossip, though malicious, could often be unfounded. Yet he would not be soothed. His voice rose harsh and commanding until Anne excused herself, leaving the room with trembling hands. When she was gone, the colonel turned to me with a bitterness that chilled my blood. If I find proof, mind you, that she has betrayed me, I swear, Clement, there will be no mercy. I shall kill her. Do you understand? Kill her! He struck his fist upon the table to emphasize the words, and I, horrified, tried to reason with him. But his temper was beyond persuasion. At last he dismissed me, leaving me to walk back to the vicarage under a sky that seemed darker than the hour required. I found no rest that night. His words echoed in my ears, an oath, spoken not in the heat of a passing quarrel but with cold determination. The threat of violence had never seemed so near in our quiet parish. The next morning I encountered Miss Marple once again, tending her roses at the edge of her garden. Her eyes, bright with curiosity, lifted to my face, and she said gently, "You look troubled, Vicar. Has something happened?" I hesitated, bound by discretion, yet something in her manner compelled honesty. Without betraying confidences, I admitted that I feared tempers were rising dangerously high in certain quarters. She nodded slowly, as though the confirmation only matched what she already suspected. One should never dismiss anger, especially in a man like the colonel. Anger is fuel. All it requires is a spark. Her words unsettled me, for they mirrored my own fears, and as if to prove them true, fresh quarrels erupted in the days that followed. At the post office, I overheard Mrs. Price Ridley declare loudly that the colonel had treated her like a criminal over a trivial matter of taxes. At the inn, I saw him berate the landlord for serving weak ale. Even the curate, poor Mr. Hawes, came under his lash, accused of incompetence in keeping parish accounts. The list of those who resented him grew longer by the day. It seemed there was scarcely a soul in St. Mary Mead who had not, at some point, muttered that the village would be better off without Colonel Prothero. And yet such words, though reckless, were usually nothing more than frustrated exaggeration. Only Miss Marple, with her shrewd eyes, seemed to treat them as ominous foreshadowing. One evening I invited Lawrence Redding to the vicarage. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, to gauge the truth of his connection with Anne, and to dissuade him from folly. He arrived restless and evasive, pacing the study as though the room could not contain him. "Redding," I said gravely, "the village is talking. You must know what that means. If you care for Mrs. Prothero's reputation and your own, you will see that your actions do not give cause for gossip." He stopped pacing, his face pale. "It is too late, Vicar, do you understand?" "Too late, and what do you mean?" I asked sharply, but he shook his head, refusing to elaborate. Instead, he left abruptly, leaving me more troubled than before. As the days shortened and the air grew heavy with summer's end, I began to feel the inevitability of some approaching disaster. Threads were drawing together, unseen but relentless, weaving a pattern that none of us could yet discern, and at the center of it all stood Colonel Prothero, the man who seemed to gather enemies as naturally as others gathered friends. The unease that had settled over the village deepened with each passing day, until it seemed to weave itself into the very air we breathed. Conversations that once turned upon harmless matters, weather, gardens, the price of eggs, now bore an undercurrent of tension, as though each speaker measured his words carefully, wary of saying too much. St. Mary Mead had always been a place where gossip thrived, but lately, whispers carried a different weight, less idle and more dangerous. I felt it first during a parish committee meeting, when Mrs. Price Ridley, red-faced and bristling, clashed with Mr. Clement over a matter so trivial that under ordinary circumstances it would have been dismissed with laughter. Instead, her voice shook with fury, and Mr. Clement's replies grew cold, clipped. Watching them, I could not shake the feeling that every irritation, every grudge had been sharpened, waiting for some release. At the heart of it inevitably lay Colonel Prothero, whose stern hand pressed upon the life of the village with such force that cracks had begun to appear everywhere. The colonel himself grew more severe, more impossible to please. His criticisms reached me even in the sanctuary of the vicarage, for he had taken to sending notes, curt, scrawled commands regarding parish affairs, accounts, even the conduct of services. Griselda laughed at them, but I found them unsettling. It was one thing to endure his temper in person, another to receive his reproaches inked across paper like judgments that could not be softened by conversation. Yet not all was storm. There were moments, small and fleeting, that revealed the village as it had once been. One such afternoon I passed Miss Marple's garden and found her kneeling among her roses, her hands carefully pruning, her eyes bright with interest as she glanced up. She never failed to read the thoughts etched upon my face. "You are troubled, Vicar," she said gently. "Perhaps more than I ought to be," I admitted, pausing at her gate. "This village has grown restless and I cannot seem to calm it." Her needles clicked as she returned to her knitting, though her gaze never left mine. Restlessness often precedes an event. Human beings sense change before it arrives. You cannot soothe it away because it is not the cause but the symptom. I frowned. "And what is the cause?" She gave the smallest of smiles. "Why, Colonel Prothero, of course. He stands at the center and all else revolves around him. The question is not whether something will happen, but when." Her certainty chilled me, for it echoed my own private fears, though I had not dared put them into words. It was as if she saw the pattern more clearly than I, each thread and knot forming the inevitable design. That evening, as the sky burned red with sunset, I received an unexpected visitor. Lawrence Redding appeared at the vicarage door, his face pale, his movements restless. He declined Griselda's offer of tea, pacing instead about my study like a man pursued by demons. "I cannot endure it, Clement," he burst out at last. "I cannot bear the whispers, the suspicion. They think they know, but they know nothing. Nothing." "Then why not tell me what it is you wish them to know?" I asked quietly. He stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment I thought he would confide in me, but then his expression closed, his jaw set. "No, not yet. But remember this, Vicar. If anything should happen, I am not afraid to face it. I shall speak the truth, whatever the cost." Before I could press him further, he was gone, leaving me staring after him in bewilderment. His words hung in the air, ominous in their vagueness. What truth did he mean to reveal? And why speak of cost, unless he anticipated a disaster yet to come? I scarcely slept that night, my mind turning restlessly over the fragments of conversation, the looks exchanged, the threats uttered. When dawn came pale and wan through the curtains, I rose unrefreshed, compelled to walk the village in search of some reassurance. But reassurance was nowhere to be found. At the inn, I heard Mr. Archer grumble that the colonel had accused him of watering the ale. At the smithy, the blacksmith muttered that the colonel had refused payment for work done. Even the children, usually oblivious to such matters, spoke in hushed tones of the colonel's temper. It was as though a net of hostility tightened around him, each knot another grievance, another reason for resentment. When I returned to the vicarage, I found Griselda waiting, her eyes bright with excitement. "You've missed quite a scene," she said. "The colonel stormed through the garden not half an hour ago, demanding to know if you were here. He was livid, positively purple with rage. I told him you were out, and off he went, muttering about accounts and dishonesty. Honestly, Leonard, I believe the man has gone quite mad." I could not disagree. The sense of approaching calamity pressed upon me so heavily that I found myself glancing at the old clock in my study, as though its steady ticking could somehow anchor me to sanity. Yet even the clock seemed to mock me, its pendulum swinging with relentless inevitability, marking the passage of time toward some event I could neither foresee nor prevent. That evening, as twilight deepened, I found myself once more in Miss Marple's company. She was seated by her window, her knitting in her lap, her eyes watching the fading light. Without preamble, she said, "It is coming soon, you know. You feel it as well as I." I nodded reluctantly. "But how can you be so certain?" She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Because I have seen it before in different guises, different villages. A man disliked, a community strained, tempers stretched to breaking. When resentment has no outlet, it seeks one, and often that outlet is violent." Her words, spoken in that calm, almost gentle tone, struck me with greater force than any dramatic outcry, for she was right. I had felt it, seen it, though I had tried to deny it. Something was approaching, something inevitable. The threads were drawing tighter, and soon the pattern would reveal itself. As I left her house and stepped into the deepening night, the air seemed charged with expectation. The village lay quiet, but beneath that quiet was a pulse, a rhythm like the ticking of a clock counting down, and I, Leonard Clement, vicar of St. Mary Mead, could do nothing but wait, uneasily aware that our lives were about to be altered forever. The night passed heavy and restless, and when morning came it carried with it a curious hush, as though the village itself had risen on tiptoe, waiting for something unnamed. I rose earlier than usual, compelled by a sense of unease I could neither justify nor ignore. The church bells seemed louder in the clear air, their solemn toll carrying across fields and gardens, yet even they could not lift the foreboding that pressed on me. Griselda teased me gently as I sat distracted over breakfast, my spoon idle in the bowl. "You look like a man expecting judgment," she said, her eyes dancing with humor, though a trace of concern lingered beneath. "Has the Colonel found a new sermon of yours to criticize?" I managed a smile, but the truth was I could not banish the memory of his words, spoken with such fury and conviction, that if proof of betrayal were ever laid before him, he would kill his wife without hesitation. It was not idle talk, I was certain of it, and yet I felt powerless to act. What could I do? Accuse him of threatening murder, when all I had was overheard anger? No, I must wait, must watch, must hope that reason would soften his heart. The hours of the day slipped by, my duties performed almost mechanically. Parishioners came and went, their complaints and requests scarcely heard, for my thoughts strayed always to the Colonel and the strange web tightening around him. When at last afternoon drew near, I sought refuge in my study, intending to prepare notes for Sunday's sermon. It was there, with the clock ticking steadily upon the mantel and the late light streaming in long golden shafts, that fate delivered its blow. The first sound was a sharp report, unmistakable, the crack of a gun. I froze, the pen slipping from my fingers, my heart hammering against my ribs. For a moment I thought it must be a shot fired in the distance, perhaps at some wandering fox. But even as the thought formed, another sound followed, the heavy thud of a body collapsing close at hand. I rose swiftly, my chair scraping against the floor. The study door was ajar, and beyond it, slumped across my desk in grotesque stillness, lay Colonel Prothero. His face was pressed against the scattered sermon notes, his uniform jacket darkened by the spreading stain of blood. The revolver rested on the floor near his outstretched hand, its barrel still faintly smoking. For an instant the world seemed to tilt, the ordinary walls of my study transformed into the setting of some dreadful play. My first impulse was disbelief. Surely it was a feint, a sudden collapse. But the silence, the dreadful stillness told me otherwise. He was dead. Colonel Prothero, the terror of the village, had been struck down in my own house. I moved closer, my hands trembling as I bent to examine him. The wound was at the head, the entry cruel and final. There was no question of life remaining. My voice, when it came, sounded strange in my own ears as I called for Griselda. She arrived almost at once, her eyes widening in horror as they fell upon the body. "Leonard, good heavens, what has happened?" "The Colonel, he has been shot," I managed to say. Her hand flew to her mouth, yet even in that moment of shock, her practical nature asserted itself. "We must send for the police. At once." I nodded, scarcely aware of my movements, as I dispatched the maid to summon Inspector Slack. Griselda remained by my side, her hand upon my arm, her gaze fixed upon the lifeless figure. The air of the study seemed stifling, the ordinary tick of the clock unbearably loud, as though mocking the final silence that now reigned. When the inspector arrived, his manner brisk and unsentimental, the atmosphere shifted from private horror to official inquiry. He questioned me rapidly, noting the details of what I had heard, the position of the body, the presence of the revolver. His eyes narrowed as he examined the wound, the papers scattered across the desk, the clock ticking with mechanical indifference. "Not suicide," he declared after a moment's inspection, "not with the angle of that shot. This is murder, Reverend, make no mistake about it." The words seemed to echo through the room. Murder. It was no longer an accident, no longer a tragic lapse. Murder had come to St. Mary Mead, and it had chosen my house as its stage. News traveled swiftly, as it always does in a village. Before long, the garden beyond my study window was alive with figures, neighbors drawn by curiosity, their voices hushed, their faces pale. Among them I saw Miss Marple standing quietly apart, her knitting bag looped over her arm. Her expression was calm, but her eyes missed nothing. The inspector, intent upon his work, scarcely noticed her, but I felt her presence as a strange reassurance. If anyone could perceive the truth of this dreadful business, it would be she. Yet even her keen mind could not alter the terrible fact. Colonel Prothero had been murdered, and his death would tear through the village like a storm. That evening stretched endlessly, filled with questions, examinations, and the first stirrings of suspicion. The inspector pressed me to recall every sound, every movement, every detail of the afternoon. Griselda, brave though shaken, repeated what she had seen and heard. The servants trembled under questioning, their accounts contradictory, confused. Then came the confession, startling, unexpected. Lawrence Redding appeared at the vicarage door, his face ashen, his voice low but steady. He declared that he had shot Colonel Prothero. He spoke with such conviction that even the inspector, hardened though he was, paused in surprise. Yet scarcely had the words been absorbed when another voice, equally steady, declared itself guilty. Anne Prothero, pale but resolute, confessed to the crime as well. 2 confessions, each contradicting the other, each delivered with an air of desperate sincerity. The inspector frowned, clearly unsettled. I, for my part, could not believe either tale. For though both had reason enough, resentment, fear, hatred, something in their manner struck me as rehearsed, too deliberate. In the garden, Miss Marple stood silently, her needles clicking softly, her eyes watchful. She said nothing, but I saw the flicker of understanding in her gaze, as though she alone discerned the truth hidden beneath the chaos of lies. And in that moment, amid the confusion, the shock, the sorrow, I felt a strange certainty. The pattern Miss Marple had spoken of was unfolding at last, and none of us could escape it. The inspector's declaration that neither confession could be accepted without proper evidence left the atmosphere in the vicarage charged with a tension unlike any I had ever known. Griselda sat close to me, her hand clasping mine with a firmness that belied the tremor in her fingers, while Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero remained in separate corners of the room, each avoiding the other's gaze, yet bound together by the strange duplicity of their claims. Miss Marple lingered near the window, her knitting in hand but her eyes unwaveringly fixed upon every detail, as though the flicker of a shadow or the tightening of a jaw might provide her with the missing thread of truth. Inspector Slack, pacing the study with deliberate steps, seemed almost exasperated. "It is plain enough that both of you cannot have fired the fatal shot," he said at last, his voice sharp. "And yet here we are, with 2 confessions, neither of which satisfies the facts as I see them. This case is already twisted beyond measure." His words carried more weight than he perhaps intended. The very presence of the colonel's lifeless body, the silent testament of the desk stained with blood, demanded resolution. But what resolution could there be when 2 people claimed responsibility for a crime that could only have been committed by one? I could not help but reflect on the colonel's words, spoken in anger the day before, of betrayal and vengeance. Had he indeed learned something that had driven his wife and her lover to desperation? Or were these confessions merely the frantic efforts of guilty consciences to shield one another from suspicion? As these thoughts pressed upon me, Inspector Slack ordered the body removed for examination. The removal of the colonel from my study was a grim affair, one that left the house oddly empty, as though the shadow of violence lingered in the very air. The servants moved about in frightened silence, whispering together in corners, their eyes wide and fearful. Griselda tried to bring comfort to them, but her own unease was scarcely hidden. When the inspector finally departed with his men, the village seemed to fall into a deeper hush. The evening sun had long since sunk beyond the trees, leaving only the pale glow of twilight. It was then that Miss Marple, who had remained so quiet throughout the questioning, at last spoke in her gentle, precise manner. "You must forgive me for intruding, Vicar," she began, her eyes turning to me with a look that was almost apologetic. "But I do feel compelled to say that matters are not nearly so simple as they appear. A confession is a curious thing. It may be truth, but more often it conceals truth, particularly when 2 confessions emerge where only one can suffice. It is much like finding 2 identical stockings in a drawer, when you know very well one must be torn. The very sameness of them ought to make one suspicious. I knew from long acquaintance that when Miss Marple spoke in such analogies, there was wisdom hidden within them. "You believe, then," I asked carefully, "that both Mr. Redding and Mrs. Prothero may be lying?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her knitting needles clicked on. Not lying precisely, no, but perhaps telling a story that they hope will serve, rather than one that is entirely accurate. People often act out of love, fear, or a misguided sense of duty. In this case, I should think all three are at work. Her words settled uneasily upon me, for they implied that the truth of the Colonel's murder might lie not in the obvious jealousies of his household, but in something deeper, more hidden. The next day dawned gray and heavy, as though the very sky mourned the dark deed. At church, the pews were filled with faces drawn long with curiosity and dread. Whispers rose and fell like the rustling of dry leaves. No sermon I could deliver would reach their hearts as powerfully as the knowledge that murder had been done in the village. I saw heads lean together, lips moving swiftly, eyes darting from one neighbor to another. Everyone had a theory, and everyone was sure of someone else's guilt. After the service, Miss Marple and I walked together through the churchyard. She observed gravestones with the same keen scrutiny she applied to the living, her quiet voice carrying thoughts that seemed to spring naturally from the silence around us. Human nature, you see, does not change much, she remarked. One must look at it as one might at the flowers here. There are varieties, yes, but certain tendencies remain constant. The Colonel was a man of harshness, intolerant of weakness, quick to anger. A man of that nature will always draw enmity. It is not surprising that many could wish him gone. What is surprising is the manner in which he has gone, and the place of it, your very study. That is significant. Significant in what way? I asked, struggling to match her calm tone. She glanced at me over her spectacles. Because it was meant to be so. A crime committed in one's own home is often unplanned, done in passion, but here we have something staged, deliberate. Why in your study, Reverend? Why not his own house or the lane or the woods? That is the question which must be asked. Her reasoning, so quietly given, struck me with force. I had been so overwhelmed by the horror of the act itself that I had not considered its setting. Why indeed had the Colonel come to me that afternoon, and why had death met him there? As the days followed, the investigation deepened. Inspector Slack questioned every soul in the village, his brusque manner stirring resentment among those who already smarted under suspicion. Alibis were demanded, movements scrutinized, words weighed for hidden meanings. Each revelation seemed only to tangle the matter further. It was whispered that Mrs. Lestrange, the mysterious woman recently arrived in the village, had met the Colonel in secret. Others insisted that young Archer, the schoolboy caught in mischief more than once, had been seen near the vicarage at the fatal hour. Still others claimed to have heard quarrels between the Colonel and his daughter Lettice. Every rumor became a thread, but when woven together they produced only confusion. And through it all, Miss Marple listened. She sat with her knitting in hand at teas and gatherings, her demeanor harmless, almost dithering. Yet I saw her eyes sharpen whenever a careless word escaped, whenever a glance lingered too long. She heard what others dismissed, and in her quiet mind the pattern was forming. One evening, as I returned from a long and wearying meeting, I found her waiting at the vicarage gate. She greeted me warmly, then said in her most matter-of-fact voice, "I think you will find, Vicar, that the timepiece in your study is of more importance than anyone realizes. I should like to take another look at it, if you don't mind." Her request startled me, but I could not refuse. Together we entered the study, now stripped of its dreadful burden but still heavy with memory. The clock ticked steadily upon the mantel, its hands precise, its chimes soft in the quiet room. Miss Marple examined it closely, her fingers tracing its polished surface, her eyes narrowing as though listening for a secret it might yield. At last she turned to me. Time, you see, is very deceptive. It is the simplest thing in the world to alter by a few minutes. And yet those few minutes can mean everything when murder is concerned. A false time can create an alibi where none exists or remove suspicion where it belongs. One must always be wary of clocks. Her words set my thoughts racing. Could it be that the clock had been tampered with? That the fatal shot had not occurred when we believed it had? And if so, who had gained by the deception? Miss Marple gave me no answer, only a small smile as she gathered her knitting once more. "Patience, dear Vicar," she said softly. "The truth is never in such a hurry as people are, but it always comes in the end." And as she left me there, alone in the dim study, I felt with sudden clarity that the village of St. Mary Mead stood upon the edge of revelation, that the tangled web was beginning to loosen, and that within its strands the face of a murderer waited to be revealed. The days that followed Miss Marple's quiet remark about the clock carried with them a restless undercurrent, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Life on the surface went on. Children ran along the lanes. Shopkeepers opened their doors at the usual hours, and the church bells rang their familiar calls. But beneath it all was the unspoken knowledge that one among us had taken a life. Each conversation seemed edged with suspicion, each glance a shade too sharp, and every neighbor weighed the other with an unease that made ordinary courtesy feel strained. I felt it most keenly in my own household. Griselda, though determined to be brave, moved about with a forced cheerfulness that only magnified her weariness. She spoke often of wishing the matter settled, of longing for peace once more. Yet I could see in her eyes the same question that haunted me. Who among those we knew so well had fired that fatal shot? The servants, too, whispered in corners, starting at every knock upon the door. My study, once a place of comfort, now seemed tainted, its quiet broken by the memory of that dreadful afternoon. Inspector Slack returned repeatedly, his manner brusque, his questions insistent. He asked after the smallest details, pressing me to recall whether the colonel had seemed agitated, whether his voice had carried anger or resignation, whether the revolver had been known to me. I could give him only the truth as I remembered it, yet each answer seemed to leave him more dissatisfied. He was convinced that either Lawrence Redding or Anne Prothero must be guilty, but the contradictions in their confessions baffled even him. It was on the third evening after the murder that Miss Marple came to the vicarage once more. She appeared almost apologetic, her small frame framed by the fading light at the doorway, her knitting bag held close as though it were a shield. Yet her eyes behind the gentle spectacles were sharp with quiet determination. I wonder, she said as soon as I had led her into the sitting room, whether you have considered the matter of the note. The note? I echoed, for I had nearly forgotten it in the welter of events. Yes, the note that summoned the colonel to your house that afternoon. You see, Vicar, such a summons is most unusual. A man like Colonel Prothero does not come to a neighbor's study without a pressing reason. And if that reason were given in writing, then surely it becomes the key to understanding why he was here at all. Her words rekindled my memory. Indeed, the colonel had mentioned receiving a note that demanded his presence. I had thought little of it at the time, so occupied was I with his sudden death, but now, under Miss Marple's calm scrutiny, it struck me with new significance. You believe the note was forged? I asked. She smiled faintly. Forged, or at the very least contrived. Such things are done more often than you might suppose. One need only imitate a hand clumsily, and the eye, expecting familiarity, will accept it as genuine. But what interests me more is the manner of delivery. Who brought it? How did it arrive? That, I think, is worth knowing. Her curiosity was relentless, yet always cloaked in gentleness, as though she asked not for her own sake, but for the world's natural order. I promised to make inquiries, though even as I did, I felt certain she had already set her own quiet channels into motion. The following day, the village seemed unusually animated. Word had spread that Lettice Prothero, the colonel's daughter, had quarreled with her father in the days before his death. Some claimed to have overheard raised voices in the garden. Others swore she had been seen in tears near the lane. Inspector Slack, seizing upon this, called Lettice in for questioning, and her pale, defiant face became the subject of every whisper in the high street. Griselda expressed indignation at the suspicion cast upon the girl. She is young, headstrong, perhaps unkind at times, but not a murderer, she insisted over supper. Yet I could see that doubt lingered even in her. Such is the nature of fear. It makes us suspect those we would otherwise defend. Miss Marple, however, was less moved by rumor. Children may be cruel in words, she observed quietly when I repeated the gossip to her, but seldom in deeds. I should think Lettice resented her father bitterly, but resentment and murder are not the same. One must always distinguish between them. Her certainty was oddly comforting, though it left unanswered the question of who had indeed pulled the trigger. The investigation reached a fevered pitch when a new piece of evidence came to light. The colonel's time of death, once thought certain, was thrown into doubt. The doctor who examined the body admitted under Slack's stern questioning that rigor and temperature could not confirm the exact hour. Suddenly the matter of the clock loomed larger than ever. Had it been tampered with, as Miss Marple suspected, If so, then the alibis that seemed so strong might crumble. I thought of her words. Time is easily altered, and yet it changes everything. Could it be that the crime had been committed earlier than we supposed, while I was absent from the study, or later when others claimed to be elsewhere? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and I longed for Miss Marple's calm assurance. One evening, as the shadows lengthened, she came to the vicarage again. She did not ask for tea, nor did she take up her knitting at once. Instead, she stood by the window looking out upon the quiet garden. "It is coming clear," she said softly, almost to herself. "The trouble is not in the deed itself, but in the way it has been made to appear. One must look not at who had cause, for many had cause, but at who had cunning. Murder is not only an act of passion, it is also an act of arrangement. That is what so many forget." Her words struck me deeply. Arrangement, yes, that was the heart of it. The colonel's death had been staged, placed in my study, timed with precision, shaped by deception. Whoever had done this was no mere hothead, but a planner, a manipulator. Before I could press her further, she turned, her face grave but not unkind. "You must be patient, Vicar. These things ripen slowly like fruit. Pluck them too soon and you are left with bitterness. But the truth will ripen. It always does." And with that, she left me once more to wrestle with doubt, while the village outside whispered and wondered, each soul turning over suspicions like stones in a field. Yet in my heart I knew that Miss Marple already saw the shape of the truth. She would wait, she would watch, and in time she would speak. The village had grown restless, as though the very hedgerows and lanes carried whispers of accusation. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of curious eyes upon me, not with blame but with the subtle pressure that comes when one is at the center of a storm. For it was in my house, my study, that the crime had unfolded, and however much the inspector thundered or the townsfolk speculated, none could escape the thought that my walls had borne witness to murder. That evening, after a long day of fruitless errands and heavy conversations, I returned to find Griselda sitting by the fire, her face set in a thoughtful frown. She looked up as I entered, her tone unusually grave. "Leonard," she said, "it will tear this village apart if something isn't resolved soon. Everyone suspects everyone else. Mrs. Price Ridley is convinced that Lettuce is guilty. The butcher swears it was Archer, and half the congregation whisper that Lawrence Redding is protecting Anne Prothero. How long can this go on?" Her voice trembled slightly, and I realized with sudden clarity how the case had seeped into every corner of our lives. There was no escaping it. Not in prayer, not in conversation, not even in the quiet sanctuary of our home. Before I could reply, the maid announced Miss Marple. She entered with her usual gentleness, her knitting in hand, her eyes keen but kindly. She greeted Griselda warmly, then settled herself into the chair opposite me. "I thought I might intrude for a little while," she said with a smile that softened her words. "There are matters upon my mind, and I fancy speaking them aloud may help." Griselda, clearly relieved by her presence, excused herself to oversee supper, leaving the two of us alone. Miss Marple did not speak at once. She arranged her wool with care, clicked her needles together, and only when the fire crackled did she lift her gaze. "You see, Vicar, the difficulty with this case is not in the abundance of suspects, but in the abundance of explanations. It is all too crowded, too convenient. Two confessions, whispered quarrels, suspicious newcomers. It is as though the scene has been set to confuse us rather than to reveal the truth." I leaned forward, my voice hushed. "You believe the murderer intended us to be overwhelmed?" "Precisely," she said, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Misdirection is a very old trick. When a conjurer waves one hand, it is the other that performs the feat. Here, we have been made to stare at quarrels and confessions, while something quieter slips by unnoticed." Her calm certainty sent a chill through me, for it was the first time I sensed that she was not merely speculating, but beginning to see clearly. "And have you discovered what it is that slipped by?" She hesitated, her needles pausing mid-air. "Not fully, but I think it has to do with the note that summoned the colonel, and with the clock. Together they form a pattern, though the final stitch is not yet drawn." As she spoke, I heard footsteps outside, and a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Slack, his coat damp with evening mist, his manner as brusque as ever. He seemed surprised to see Miss Marple, though he greeted her with a stiff nod. "I've come from the Prothero house," he announced, brushing past into the room. "New evidence has turned up. A shot was heard earlier than we thought, between 6 and half past, not nearer to 7. That throws half the alibis into question. Miss Marple looked at him calmly, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. How curious, she said softly. And did this evidence come by way of memory or of convenience? Slack frowned, clearly irritated. Memory, of course. A farmhand swears he heard it while crossing the field. She smiled faintly but offered no argument. Yet I, who knew her ways, recognized that her mind was already at work, weighing this new testimony against the pattern she had begun to trace. When the inspector left, still muttering about unreliable villagers, Miss Marple remained seated, her expression distant. Do not be deceived by sudden recollections, Vicar. People often remember what suits them, especially when their own skins are at risk. But there is something in it nonetheless. The timing is crucial. It means the crime could have been done when we were all looking elsewhere. Her words lingered with me through the night, and I found myself lying awake, listening to the quiet tick of the clock in the hall, wondering how a handful of minutes could shift suspicion from one soul to another. The next day brought further turmoil. Lawrence Redding was arrested on suspicion of murder, his confession taken as evidence of guilt. The village buzzed with the news, half satisfied, half doubtful. Some said justice had been done, others that it was too neat, too quick. Anne Prothero, pale and drawn, visited the vicarage to speak with Griselda. Her composure brittle, her grief edged with fear. I could not help but pity her, for whether guilty or not, she bore the weight of a scandal that would never leave her. Miss Marple, when she heard of the arrest, merely shook her head. It is tidy, she said, but not true. Lawrence may have fired a shot, but it was not the shot. That is the distinction that matters. Her quiet assurance unsettled me more than Slack's loud certainty, for I trusted her instinct. She spoke not as one guessing, but as one who had already glimpsed the outline of the truth. That evening, she asked to walk with me through the lane that led past the Prothero house. The air was cool, the hedges heavy with shadow. She paused often, gazing at the ground, at the hedgerows, at the windows dimly lit in the distance. You see, Vicar, she murmured at last, murder is not merely an act of anger. It is an arrangement, as I said before. The body was placed in your study, the time disguised, the blame scattered like seed to every corner of the village. But when you scatter seed, you must also tend to the soil. Some patches will take, others will not. That is where the mistake lies, and that is where we shall find the truth. Her words, though enigmatic, filled me with a strange hope. For the first time since that dreadful afternoon, I felt we were drawing nearer, that the fog of suspicion was thinning, and that soon, very soon, the hand that had struck down Colonel Prothero would be revealed. The days that followed were heavy with tension, as though the village itself had drawn in a sharp breath and was waiting to exhale. Rumor flowed through St. Mary Mead like water, seeping into every corner, through the market, the churchyard, the post office, and the quiet lanes. Everywhere I went, voices hushed as I approached, eyes flickered away, and yet beneath the politeness one could feel the raw energy of suspicion. The arrest of Lawrence Redding had not brought the relief Inspector Slack so confidently proclaimed it would. Instead, it seemed to deepen the unease, for while some believed the young artist guilty, others whispered that it had all been arranged too neatly, that the story had been smoothed to fit, but the jagged edges remained. I confess, I was torn myself. Lawrence had spoken passionately of love and desperation, and I could imagine a reckless shot fired in anger. Yet Miss Marple's quiet certainty gnawed at me. She had been unshaken by each revelation, calmly knitting, calmly listening, while others floundered in shock or indignation. There was something in her demeanor that told me she had seen through the fog long before the rest of us. And though she said little, her rare remarks carried more weight in my mind than the inspector's grand pronouncements. One evening, as I sat with Griselda after supper, Miss Marple called again. She looked a little weary, though her eyes retained their brightness. She declined tea, settled herself into her chair, and after a pause began in her gentle, almost apologetic tone. I have been thinking a great deal, Vicar. Sometimes the mind arranges things without one's knowing it, and then quite suddenly, one sees the pattern as though it had been there all along. I believe we are nearly at the end of this dreadful affair. Griselda leaned forward, visibly relieved. You mean you know who did it? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, as though the rhythm steadied her thoughts. I believe I do, but one must be cautious. Suspicion is not proof, and proof is what the law requires. Still, the pieces fit too well to be coincidence. The note, the clock, the confessions, each was part of a design. And like all designs, there is one thread that runs through and binds them together. I could not help myself. Then for heaven's sake, tell us plainly, Miss Marple. Who killed Colonel Prothero? She looked at me with that kindly firmness she often wore when chiding a child. Patience, Vicar. A little more must unfold before all is clear. If I spoke too soon, the guilty party might slip away or worse, act again. No, it must be timed properly, just as the crime itself was timed. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized that she was not merely unraveling a puzzle, but watching for the moment when the truth could safely be revealed. The following morning, Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage bursting with indignation. He had just come from questioning Anne Prothero, and his report was delivered in the tone of a man who expected his conclusions to be accepted as fact. She's hiding something, he declared. Mark my words, that woman knows more than she lets on. Lawrence killed the colonel, yes, but I'd wager she put him up to it. The pair of them plotted together. Miss Marple, who had arrived just moments earlier, listened without interruption. When Slack at last finished, she merely said, "It is always wise, Inspector, to ask oneself whether the neatest explanation is too neat. People in love are rarely so tidy in their crimes. They make mistakes, foolish, impulsive mistakes. This," she glanced at me, her eyes sharp, "was no impulsive act." Slack muttered something about amateur detectives and stalked off, leaving me once again in awe of Miss Marple's quiet authority. Later that day, she asked me to walk with her again, this time toward the woods that bordered the Prothero estate. The afternoon was gray, the air damp and the ground soft beneath our feet. She moved slowly, stopping often to peer at some small detail, a broken twig, a scuff in the soil, the way a branch bent as though pressed by a body. "You see, Vicar," she said at last, "the land remembers. We may forget what hour it was or who stood where, but the earth and the air, they are more reliable witnesses than people. Someone moved carefully here, more carefully than one who acts in sudden passion, and that tells us something about the mind behind the crime." As we turned back toward the village, I could not shake the sense that she was leading me step by step, preparing me for the revelation that was coming. The following Sunday, my sermon was almost an afterthought. I spoke the words, but my mind wandered. I saw the faces of the congregation, Anne pale and withdrawn, Lettice restless and defiant, Lawrence absent in his cell, Mrs. Price Ridley sharp-eyed and full of suspicion, and near the front Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, her expression calm but watchful. I wondered how many in that room she silently measured, how many she had already judged and dismissed, until only one remained. That evening, as the bells tolled in the distance, Miss Marple asked Griselda and me to meet her in her cottage. We found her seated at the table, papers and notes spread neatly before her, the knitting finally set aside. "It is time," she said simply. "The matter must be resolved before it consumes the whole village. Tomorrow I shall speak with the inspector, but tonight I will tell you both so that you may understand the truth before it is laid bare." Her words sent my heart racing. Griselda grasped my hand, her face pale with anticipation, and there in the quiet of her little sitting room, Miss Marple began to lay out the story, not as fragments, not as speculation, but as a tapestry woven whole, each thread falling into place. The air in Miss Marple's sitting room felt dense with expectancy, as though the very walls leaned closer to hear what she was about to say. The ticking of the small mantel clock punctuated the silence, and beyond the curtained window, the night pressed in heavily, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Griselda sat forward, her fingers entwined tightly, while I tried to compose myself, though my nerves betrayed me with a restless tapping of my foot upon the carpet. Miss Marple, however, was the very image of composure. Her hands, folded neatly, rested on the table before her, her gaze steady but not unkind. "It is a terrible thing," she began, her voice quiet yet carrying unmistakable authority, "to accuse someone of murder, but when all the signs point in the same direction, one can no longer ignore them. What has seemed a tangle of confusion is, in truth, a design carefully laid out. A clever design, yes, but even the cleverest designs carry within them the seeds of their own undoing." She paused, her eyes shifting from me to Griselda. I should like you to listen carefully because what I am about to say must be repeated faithfully to Inspector Slack tomorrow. The truth will come as a shock, perhaps even to you, but it is the truth nonetheless. I swallowed hard, bracing myself. The thought of finally hearing the name of the murderer filled me with both dread and relief. Yet true to her habit, Miss Marple did not give it at once. Instead, she began to trace the web that had been spun, each strand linking to another. From the very beginning, there was deceit. The note left for the vicar, the shifting of the clock, the supposed quarrels that distracted us, each was meant to muddy the waters. But what struck me was the precision. This was no reckless shot fired in a fit of rage. No, this was planned, thought out, and executed with extraordinary care. The murderer knew the habits of Colonel Prothero, the layout of the vicarage study, and above all, how to make use of time itself as a weapon. Griselda gave a little gasp, and Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, time. That was the key. The alteration of the clock was not a mere afterthought. It was the heart of the plan. To mislead us about when the murder took place was to grant the murderer an alibi, to divert suspicion, and to entangle others in confusion. Her words painted the crime in a chilling new light. I had thought of the murder as an isolated act of violence, a sudden eruption in our quiet village. But in Miss Marple's telling, it became something colder, more deliberate, a trap constructed with patience and skill. Consider Lawrence Redding, she went on, her tone sharpening slightly. His confession was convenient, was it not? Too convenient. He spoke as a man in love, desperate, guilty. But what if his guilt was of another kind? What if he knew of the crime, but not in the way he claimed? And Anne Prothero, she too confessed, but her words rang false to me. A woman will sometimes sacrifice herself for love, but she does not sacrifice herself so clumsily, nor contradict herself so easily. Their confessions were not truths, but shields erected to protect another. Griselda leaned forward, her voice trembling. But who, Miss Marple? Who were they protecting? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she rose, walked slowly to the mantelpiece, and adjusted the clock, setting it back to its proper time. Then she turned, her expression grave. You will know tomorrow, she said softly. It must be revealed properly in the presence of the inspector and all concerned. But tonight it is enough that you understand the pattern. The murderer was not driven by passion alone, but by necessity. To remove Colonel Prothero was to secure freedom, independence, and the preservation of secrets too dangerous to be left in his keeping. Her words hung in the room like smoke, lingering, curling around us, filling every corner. I felt both enlightened and yet tormented by the withholding of the final revelation. For though I now understood the shape of the crime, the identity of the hand that had pulled the trigger remained shrouded. We parted that night with heavy hearts, Miss Marple sending us off with her usual gentleness, though beneath it I sensed the iron will of one who had already decided the course of things. Griselda and I walked home in silence, the chill air biting at our faces, the path lit faintly by the glow of the moon. That night I dreamed of clocks striking wrong hours, of voices confessing in the dark, of Miss Marple's calm face bending over her knitting, while behind her lurked a shadow that would not take form. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that seems in its brightness to mock the troubles of men. Yet the village carried an air of expectancy. People lingered outside the post office, whispered at the gates, exchanged looks heavy with meaning. Word had spread that Miss Marple had asked for a meeting with Inspector Slack, and when Miss Marple asked for such a thing, the village knew something was afoot. At the appointed hour, we gathered in the drawing room of the vicarage. Inspector Slack stood with arms folded, his expression skeptical but tinged with unease. Anne Prothero, pale as parchment, sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Lettuce lingered by the window, restless, biting her lip. Lawrence Redding had been brought from custody, his face drawn but his eyes defiant. Mrs. Price Ridley, though not invited, had contrived to appear, sitting primly in a corner as though by sheer will she might make herself part of the official proceedings. And at the center of it all sat Miss Marple, her needles clicking steadily, her gaze moving from one to the other with quiet assurance. My friends, she began, her voice calm but carrying easily through the room. We are gathered here to set right what has been confused, to bring into the light what has been hidden. A crime has been committed, a terrible crime, And though we have sought the answer in many places, the truth has been before us all along. It is time now to speak plainly so that justice may be done." The room held its breath. Inspector Slack shifted, clearly prepared to argue, but something in Miss Marple's bearing held him back. "The murder of Colonel Prothero," she continued, "was not the work of a single hand in a sudden fit of rage. It was planned with care, executed with precision, and cloaked with deceit. Two people stood at the heart of it, bound by necessity and by a secret they sought to protect." Her needles ceased their clicking, and the silence that followed was absolute. Then slowly she looked up, her eyes sharp as they fixed upon the guilty. "The murderer is—" Her words cut off there, hanging in the air like the final stroke of a clock before the chime. The gasp that followed came not only from Griselda and myself, but from every soul in the room, for in that instant, though the name had not yet been spoken, I believe we all felt the noose tightening, the truth pressing against us. Undeniable and fierce, the revelation was upon us, hovering just at the edge, and the world seemed to hold itself poised, waiting for the last piece to fall into place. The silence that hung over the vicarage drawing room was so profound that one could almost hear the collective heartbeat of those assembled. All eyes were fixed upon Miss Marple, who sat in her modest chair as if she were presiding over some ancient tribunal. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap now, as though they too had paused to listen. The tension was unbearable. I felt Griselda's fingers clutching at my sleeve, and even Inspector Slack, usually so brusque and full of bluster, shifted uneasily on his feet. When Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice was steady, almost gentle, yet it carried the weight of undeniable authority. "The murderer," she said, "was not Lawrence Redding, nor was it Anne Prothero. Both of them, in their misguided confessions, were attempting to shield another. No, the truth lies elsewhere. The murder of Colonel Prothero was the joint work of Anne and Lawrence together." A collective gasp broke from the room. Lawrence's face drained of color, his lips parting in a soundless protest. Anne shut her eyes tightly as if willing herself into silence. Inspector Slack exclaimed something about impossible and nonsense, but Miss Marple raised her hand, silencing him. "Yes," she continued, "it was a conspiracy. The two of them, bound together by passion and desperation, saw no other way forward than to remove the colonel. Anne could not endure her husband's cruelty, his control, his threats. Lawrence, enamored and reckless, could not bear to see the woman he loved trapped in such misery. And so together they planned it. But the cleverness of the scheme lay in making it appear impossible that either could have committed the act. They contrived to confuse the time of the murder and to lay a false trail of suspicion." She leaned slightly forward, her eyes bright. The altered clock was their masterpiece. It suggested that the murder occurred later than it did, thus providing alibis where none truly existed. The note that brought the colonel to the vicarage was part of the same design, as were the conflicting confessions that followed. Anne sought to shield Lawrence, Lawrence to shield Anne, but in truth both were guilty, and their misguided loyalty to each other only confirmed the bond that had made them capable of such a deed. The room erupted into murmurs, exclamations, disbelief. Mrs. Price Ridley sat bolt upright, her expression triumphant, as though all her suspicions had been vindicated. Lettice turned pale and moved as if to leave the room, but Miss Marple's calm gaze held her where she stood. Lawrence, meanwhile, broke into a torrent of words, protesting that Miss Marple was mistaken, that he alone had done it, that Anne knew nothing. His voice cracked under the weight of his own desperation, and the more he insisted, the more it became clear that he and Anne had acted in concert. Anne finally spoke, her voice low and tremulous. "It is true," she whispered. "I could not bear it any longer. He was cruel, harsh, he would have ruined us both. Lawrence loved me and I loved him. We thought we were clever. We thought no one would ever see through it." Her head sank into her hands, and a silence followed that was heavier than any outburst. Inspector Slack, for once, was struck dumb. When he finally recovered, he muttered something about evidence and statements. But even he knew that Miss Marple's words had struck at the very heart of the matter. Miss Marple did not gloat, nor did she soften. She simply said, "It is always the small things that betray the truth." The clock was too neatly set, the confessions too conveniently given. Human nature is rarely so tidy. One only had to watch, to listen, to recall what people said in unguarded moments, and the pattern revealed itself. I felt a strange mixture of horror and relief. Horror at the thought that two people driven by love had conspired to such a crime. Relief that at last the riddle had been solved, that the shadows which had hung over our village might now be dispelled. Anne was led away, Lawrence following in stunned silence. The room slowly emptied, villagers murmuring among themselves, glancing at Miss Marple with awe and fear, as though she were some figure out of legend rather than the quiet spinster who had lived among them all her life. When at last only Griselda, Miss Marple, and I remained, I turned to her and said, "You saw it all along, didn't you? From the very beginning?" She smiled faintly, taking up her knitting once more. "Not all at once, Vicar. But I have seen much of human nature in my time, and people do not change very much. One remembers little incidents from the past, cases of love, of jealousy, of desperation, and one applies them to the present. It is really quite simple once one knows where to look." Griselda shook her head in wonder. "Simple? I should call it extraordinary." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she replied, "Extraordinary things are often quite ordinary when one understands them. It is only that most people prefer not to see." Outside, the bells of the church told the hour, steady and calm, as though to remind us that time moved ever onward, indifferent to the passions and crimes of men. And as I looked at Miss Marple, serene in her little chair, I realized that though the case was ended, her watchful eyes would never rest. For wherever human folly and frailty lay hidden, she would see, and she would understand. The murder at the vicarage was finished, the truth laid bare, the guilty revealed. Yet in its ending it seemed less a conclusion than a reminder that even in the quietest of villages, beneath the surface of ordinary life, darkness may stir, waiting for the sharp eyes of a little old lady with knitting in her lap to bring it into the light. The village settled back into its rhythm after the storm, though the ripples of the crime would be felt for many months to come. St. Mary Mead, with its neat gardens, its church bells, and its endless chatter, had once more proven that beneath the surface of ordinary life lay all the dramas of the human heart: jealousy, cruelty, desperation, and love. People spoke of the trial in hushed tones, shook their heads at the tragedy of it all, and then returned to their gossip, their teacups, and their roses. For myself, I carried with me the memory of those tense evenings, of Anne's pale face and Lawrence's trembling defiance, of the moment when Miss Marple's quiet voice revealed what no one else had dared to see. I thought often of the Colonel, not with affection, for he had been a harsh and difficult man, but with a kind of solemn pity. His death had torn the veil from our little village and shown us how far people will go when cornered by love and fear. Miss Marple, however, remained unchanged. She returned to her garden, her teas, and her endless knitting as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet whenever I looked at her, I saw not just a gentle old lady, but a mind sharp as steel, one that had seen deeper into the human soul than any inspector or magistrate ever could. One afternoon, as Griselda and I took tea with her in her cottage, I could not help saying, "It astonishes me, Miss Marple, how you saw through everything when the rest of us were blind." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "It is only that one sees the same patterns again and again, Vicar. Human beings repeat themselves endlessly. A quarrel here, a lie there, a little deceit born of fear or love, it is all very ordinary. And if one has lived long enough, one recognizes it, that is all." Griselda shook her head in admiration. "Ordinary? I should say it was the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen." Miss Marple only laughed softly, took up her needles, and returned to her knitting. The sun streamed gently through the window, lighting the neat little room, and for a moment all seemed perfectly peaceful. Yet I knew, as surely as I knew the sound of the church bell, that if ever another shadow fell upon our quiet village, Miss Marple would be there, patient, observant, ready to draw the truth out of the smallest of details. And so the case of the murder at the vicarage came to its close, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty that justice once again had been done.